Today, I'm in the company of Jeffrey Schnapp, who is professor of Romance and Comparative Literatures at Harvard University, where he also teaches in the Department of Architecture and in the School of Design. He is the founder and director of the Harvard MetaLAB, the co-director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, and lastly, the chief visionary officer at Piaggio Fast Forward. He was trained as a medievalist, and his work spans from Dante to futurism, from fascism to studies on design, from the history of book to digital humanities and media, from scholarly publications in several languages and curatorial collaborative projects to active entrepreneurship. He has been a speaker at some of the world's most prestigious venues, including, among others, TED, the United Nations, the Royal Academy of Sweden, the Global Leaders Forum, the U.S. National Archives, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and the Fondazione Corriere della Sera. It would take us too much time to list all your achievements here, but I invite you to watch some of his lectures on YouTube to get a sense of the vastness of his work. Now, if I were to choose an adjective to define his personality, I would probably pick the Greek word polutropon of many ways, with which Homer captures the temperament and intelligence of Ulysses. If I were to find a synthetic description of his work, I would probably go with your own motto, which is, eventually everything connects. We'll figure out why in this interview. As a student of yours and now colleague, it is a real honor to have you on the show today. So welcome, Jeffrey, and thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure, Luca.
So we'll talk today about digital humanities, knowledge design, new media, the internet, and the relationship between academia and entrepreneurship. So to start, what are the digital humanities and what is the MetaLAB project?
So the label, the phrase digital humanities is a phrase that began to be used starting sometime in the early 2000s to describe what in reality is a conversation between the humanistic disciplines, the cultural disciplines, and computation that goes back really to the end of World War II. But that conversation changed over the course of those many decades. And the ways that it changed are illustrated by the kinds of projects that were undertaken as experiments of applying different kinds of computational methods to the analysis, to the study of humanistic corpora. Along the path that was followed, we start with concordances to the works of Thomas Aquinas. If we go back to the very beginnings, we move through what are referred to as corpus linguistics, in other words, studies of word frequency, word patterns, and so forth. But by the time we get to the end of the 1990s, a couple of revolutions really transformed the nature of the dialogue between the digital and the fields that are associated with the humanities. The first is personal computing, the fact that from large room-sized devices or office desktop-type devices, we move increasingly into the everyday realm where computation is part of everyday life, so that a computer becomes a part of a domestic environment, not to mention a teaching environment, a classroom, every office, and so forth. The second, and perhaps the most important one, is the advent of the World Wide Web, where those devices that are now everywhere in modern life are connected through a network in a way that increasingly creates a new series of public spaces, a new set of models of communication, a whole new set of possibilities for how we disseminate, produce, and share knowledge and and generate even new knowledge forms. So usually the phrase digital humanities refers to that moment when we move from that earlier model of humanities computing to a new model. And MetaLAB is an heir to, I think, that shift. For me, that shift shaped the first lab that I built, which was the Stanford Humanities Lab, which started in 1999 and ended a decade later in 2009 when I left Stanford, where I taught for a long time. And that shift is one that, in the particularly the way I have interpreted it, and this is central to the answer to your second question of what MetaLAB really is that it opens up the possibility for really not just expanding the way we have produced knowledge and communicated scholarly knowledge, for example, studied texts, produced interpretations, aggregated information from different sources and produced editions. The story is not just one of continuing those practices, but starting to think about the universe of possibilities that has opened up that's different, discontinuous, or maybe continuous only in part with those traditional practices of scholarship and cultural communication. So a center like MetaLAB is really an experimental platform. You'll notice that we don't have the word digital and we don't have the word humanities in the title of MetaLAB. MetaLAB is deliberately a little bit sibylline in its title. We don't limit ourselves to working on the humanities, because once you start working with data sets, you realize very quickly that what you're looking for, what really is interesting, are interesting data sets. And sometimes those data sets don't come from the fields that we were trained in. But once you start to know how to express them, how to work critically with them, how to work creatively with them, you understand that many of the tasks that we were carrying out in the humanities actually apply and carry over very powerfully to working, for example, with data sets that document human interactions with the environment. Similarly, the word digital isn't in the title of MetaLAB because a lot of what we do, a lot of the experiments that we carry out with new cultural forms, new knowledge forms, are often express themselves in the analog world. They're often about building things, about making things, about establishing new relationships between the mind and the hand. And so the digital, of course, is there. The digital is very much a part of all knowledge production practices in all fields today. But it always expresses itself ultimately in the world that we inhabit, the world of bodies, the analog world. And so MetaLAB really thinks of itself as a kind of experimental platform for modeling new and experimental genres of scholarly practice, cultural practice, and the like. So digital humanities is certainly a broad umbrella that expresses what we do, but we think of it as certainly going beyond the notion that there's something distinctive about digital humanities. Humanities disciplines have absorbed the digital, I think, already, and the word digital seems like a little bit of an anachronism almost at this point, just as you wouldn't speak about digital physics.
No, definitely. Also, the ability as a humanist to read data is one of the key features of the modern contemporary intellectual. Also, I want to take you to Harvard now, because like on top of the first ramp of the stairs in the Widener Library on campus, there is an object on display that always catalyzes the attention of every visitor. It's Gutenberg's original Bible, one of the 23 complete copies of the first major work printed in Europe with movable type. That object really embodies the transformation that it stirred in the production and circulation of knowledge. Now, not far from the library in the Science Center at Harvard, there is also a computer, the Mark I. It's one of the early computers still in existence, which dates back from the early 1940s. We can actually say that this computer symbolically stages another revolution in the process of construction and transmission of knowledge, a revolution that, as you were saying, is still ongoing, like from the 1947 invention of the transistor to the 1989 invention of the World Wide Web. So far from any defensiveness, cliched defensiveness toward the past or naivete toward the future, you observe this phenomena of change with a rare mix of curiosity and depth in your work on the digital humanities and in the MetaLAB. My question is, like, what new knowledge does a different medium, so like print or now the digital, bring to the questions that the human sciences investigate? Why is technology, or more specifically computing, important to the understanding of the humanities?
Well, that's a great framing of a really big question, and it's a question that is really integral to the work that I've been pursuing really since as far back, I suppose, as when I was the on-site director of the Dante project at Dartmouth back in the early 80s. It was the first National Endowment for the Humanities Digital Humanities project, working with Robert Hollander, who was the leader and founder of that project. And I think that's actually a good example of the beginnings of an answer to this very important question. A database implies a certain kind of scale, a potentially expandable scale that goes well beyond the confines of a book. A book is a kind of powerful universe, but it's a concentrated universe. A book that's over a certain scale begins to become an unwieldy object. So there's certain ways in which the physicality of an embodiment of a knowledge form or a cultural form begins to shape norms. And that we see this happening over the centuries in every moment in history. And for me, technologies are cultural, and culture is an array and assembly of technologies. These are the two cultures problem is a creation of the 19th and 20th centuries, but it's one that I think is quickly dissipating, and it's one that we really need to scrutinize critically. So back to this question of how embodiments, if you like, of culture and knowledge shape those norms, and then those norms get naturalized. In academic culture and scholarship, we've seen how a certain iteration of print culture that's associated with the production of monographs, scholarly monographs in the humanities, as the gold standard for scholarly practice, or specialized journal articles in the case of most fields. Those are genres that have not been with us for all of the centuries. In the 19th century, most of our colleagues would have been really surprised by the idea that monographs are the gold standard for scholarly production. And instead, they would have thought that being a great and compelling public lecturer was a far more serious, scientific, scholarly expression of being knowledgeable, being an expert in a field. And these norms change over the course of time. And we're living through a really transformational moment, as your question implied, in this passage between print culture, industrial print culture, which itself transformed many aspects of print, and the era of not just computation, but especially digital media. It's that combination, I think, that has really made it possible to think differently, not only about how we communicate and disseminate, but also, I think, more importantly, how we even ask research questions. So I guess my first answer to your question with regard to how our understanding changes is that there's really the potential for a shift in scale with respect to the kinds of research questions that people in the humanities address. And I mentioned the database as an example because I think it's a very pertinent example. If you are an expert in a cultural field, to achieve deep expertise and knowledge of, let's say, if you're a literary scholar, maybe 50, 100 books is already a tremendous accomplishment, because what we understand by expertise is, of course, a deep knowledge, the ability to recall, to grapple with ideas in a text, with its vocabulary, with its stylistic attributes, and then to locate it in a larger field. When you add to that core set of competencies the ability to work with not just tens or hundreds of texts, but with thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, not in the same way you would work with 5 or 10 or even 100, but with new methods, you enter into a world where you can think in a different way. You can ask different kinds of research questions, and how you express the outcome of that new process of dialogue between zoomed out, huge scale kinds of forms of inquiry and these very zoomed in, close at hand forms of questioning is itself a kind of open question. There's no simple way to express that passage, that kind of zooming from the micro to the meso to the macro and back. And digital culture prompts us constantly to perform these kinds of operations. And that's the space of invention that really interests me in particular. So a concrete example of a new genre of expression, of storytelling, of argument is data visualization, which is one of the areas that MetaLAB works in with particular interest and energy. Data visualization is a kind of storytelling mode. It's an interactive storytelling mode. It requires data sets. It requires a knowledge of how data is structured, its architecture. And it also can't be done naively. It's a craft practice. It's an art. It's a critical practice when it's done well. And it's a creative practice. So it really cuts across all these boundary lines that in a traditional academic environment would be very significant partitions. It's also beautiful when it's done well, and it has an audience that is a different audience than the audience of scholarship, but it can serve scholarly purposes. Those are the kind of messy equations that really interest me, and I'll just cite one example of how powerful a genre data visualization is, just as an example. If you look at the New York Times ranking of its most popular, most influential pieces year after year over the last 10 years, in most years over the last decade, a data visualization has been the story that was read by the most readers of the New York Times. That's what a powerful genre it is. So how do you bring this practice, for example, into the scholarly world or into the museum world? How do you engage it with interpreting cultural corpora? There's no simple answer to that question, but those are the kind of forms of experimentation that I'm really interested in engaging with. And the one core feature of MetaLAB that I would want to underscore is we're all about practice. Like, we're about making stuff, modeling stuff, not high-level theoretical kind of discussions about what the humanities could do or should do. We're really interested. When I say experimentation, what I'm referring to is a practice that's all about making stuff, and that means succeeding and it means failing. But it means a different culture than the culture of traditional scholarship, in the sense it's all about iteration, about making, about propositions that are test propositions.
And also the ability to make is the essential character of poetry itself, which means making.
Thank you for pointing that out, because that's crucial to, the process of poetic production is always brought together, in a sense, the same kind of messiness of the world, if you like, to make it somehow mean. To really connect the universal and the particular, and also to endow the technological with our human questions and our human desires. So in this sense, the practice of knowledge, and we'll get to this in a second, the design of knowledge. Now, in episode 11, dedicated to Camillo and Adriano Olivetti, we discussed about the intersection, again, of aesthetics and technology in the manufacturing of typewriters, in that case. With Gutenberg, letters, so the actual metal types or the fonts, become objects of design. With the 20th century avant-garde, letters actually move beyond their textual form and become graphic signs that are endowed with totally independent meanings. And we see it now in contemporary advertising or in the web, where letters convey messages with astounding lightness and speed. Now, in your work, you often talk about knowledge, and this is something you mentioned earlier, as a visual gesture, as a practice, or as design. And you often refer to yourself not simply as an intellectual or a cultural historian, but rather as a knowledge designer. In a world where knowledge, and you said this before, especially academic, where knowledge is heavily bound to verbal or textual communication, what does it mean that we can't know something unless we design it? Well, so I think the place I would start in answering that question is with the word design itself, which is an extremely rich word, because, of course, it begins, particularly in its Italian derivations, with the notion of drawing. And gradually over the course of its history, it's become more and more encompassing. It's come to mean drawing, and this was actually true even in the pre-industrial era, drawing in the mind versus drawing on a support, like paper, for example. So that combination between conceptualization, between dreaming as drawing, if you like, and drawing as a material practice, as a form of production, begins to hint at, I think, the way in which there's always design in every knowledge form, in every form of cultural communication. It's just that sometimes we don't see that design because those design decisions have become naturalized. They've become acculturated. They've become the norm. And so that's certainly true, I think, with forms of scholarly knowledge as they get codified during the 20th century in particular and associated with certain print forms. It's just that all that design work is hidden, or it's being carried out by others than the scholars themselves. The scholars become just one cog within a larger structure that produces certain knowledge forms. I mean, I think as Bruno Latour's work on laboratories going back to the 1970s shows is that these models of production always involve design functions integrated into them. It's just their level of visibility diminishes. So by emphasizing design, in my case, not only obviously I'm reflecting my own bias and my own set of intellectual interests in the history of design as a piece of cultural history, but also what I'm trying to underscore is the opportunity that we have today in the context of this really messy explosion of forms and the lack of clear and fully standardized norms that the digital revolution, the digital media revolution in particular, has brought to us. And that opportunity is to put design back at the center of what a scholar does. And many of the great intellectual figures of the past were already doing this in their own environment. W.B. Du Bois, for example, is one of my favorite examples, whose most students of Du Bois's work are not terribly familiar with the fact that he was fascinated by data visualization already at the turn of the 19th century, trying to think about how to communicate statistical data in ways that would compellingly support and make arguments, exactly the kinds of arguments that he made in his scholarly work. And it's this crisscrossing between developing, experimenting with, modeling knowledge forms, and extending and enhancing and reinforcing the power of the kind of knowledge that we produce in more conventional ways that really excites me, especially about the contemporary moment where we can really think outside of the box and not just think about, it's not a question just of replacing or displacing consolidated and consecrated and important traditions of inquiry. It's really about how do we make them matter, because making them matter socially is not a trivial task, and it's not about, in my view, it's not what the French used to call, haute divulgation. In other words, it's not just about watering them down for the mass audience. It's about making them matter to people so that we can defend and make arguments for the fields and the cultural objects and the domains that we believe are really important to the human experience. So for me, knowledge design is a way of just packaging together this opportunity that we have as scholars to, every time we ask a research question, to ask also a question about what forms it should assume, not taking for granted that there exist these already consolidated forms and that those are necessarily the natural and proper form for producing a contribution to a field or being an innovative practitioner in a field today. And I think behind this, I suppose, is a kind of attempt to reimagine what it is to be a public intellectual in 21st century circumstances. I think we're seeing the rebirth of public intellectualism under circumstances where the whole notion of what it is to be an intellectual is changing, and that's an opportunity, not a threat to traditional forms of expertise. But we have to be players. We have to be part of that broader societal conflict and conversation. We can't just stand back and hope that people will rediscover that we are virtuous experts in our little ivory towers. And the way we do that is by innovating, by not just sitting back and reinforcing and repeating patterns of scholarly dissemination that come from the past. Last point, those traditional models that are print-based have been in trouble for 100 years. They've been in a constant struggle with the realities of the marketplace. And while it's entirely appropriate in many cases to worry about too much of a market-oriented approach to scholarly communication, it's also essential for scholarly communication to be visible, accessible, and to communicate in ways that reach audiences that are not just the audiences in our specialist circles. So there's a real challenge there, and also a set of opportunities, as I see it.
No, definitely, this is also the role. The intellectual is always called to read reality, to read through reality, to imagine, to fashion new words, new possibilities. Also, we discussed about the idea of design thinking, especially in episode 18 with Mauro Porcini, the chief designer of Pepsi, as a source of innovation also in the production of objects. So design is really a key component in the manufacturing, the fashioning of ideas, but, as I was saying, also of objects that are really carriers of meaning. And we discussed this also in the episode on Alfonso Bialetti and the creation of the Mocha, mentioning one of your most interesting articles on the creation of the Mocha. So now, to go back to my experience in Harvard classes, I really remember the impression that I had in one of your classes when you brought for us students to see the 1973 Divisumma calculator by Mario Bellini. I really never thought that an object could mean as much as a book. And also, as a classicist myself, I really did not expect, like a Dante scholar, to focus an entire class on a calculator. So, in your intellectual journey, how is Dante connected to the avant-gardes and design? And why do you teach a course on Italian cultural history based on objects rather than literary masterpieces? And if I may, conversely, can literary culture instead drive technological innovation?
Well, so I'll go back to what I said just a few minutes ago regarding the relationship between the technical sphere and the cultural sphere. I really see them as deeply intertwined, contrary to C.P. Snow, and never more intertwined than they are today. But going back to the Middle Ages, which was an important, my training as a medievalist for me was really an important part of my own intellectual trajectory and professional trajectory. The point I would make to start out with is that what literature was, in the context of the High Middle Ages in particular, was profoundly different than what literature became under circumstances of the industrialization of print as a medium. Dante was not only a polymath who wrote on scientific arguments as well as theological and philosophical ones, as well as being, one of the absolutely great poetic geniuses of the Western tradition, but his very notion of literary communication was multimedial by our standards today. The kind of material formats for which he imagined his comedy implied polychrome communication, multiple colors, the interplay of illumination with text. The notion of text, of writing itself, was considered to be profoundly expressive. The hand in which a work was transcribed becomes, by the time of the early Renaissance, one of the ways that a writer expresses himself. Petrarch is most famously committed to certain scribal practices as being integral to his poetic message. Unfortunately, we don't have any manuscripts of Dante, so we don't know what his graphic expression of choice would have been, but the poem tells us at many junctures just how important he imagined that material aspect of a literary text to be. So I see culture as always made up of these forms of hybridity that then gradually gel and get normalized and become naturalized somehow, much as I was saying with respect to print culture. And the Middle Ages was really a laboratory for experiments with these kinds of forms. And it certainly stimulated in me, maybe because I came to medieval studies from 20th century studies. I didn't start as a medievalist initially. I always had interests that were divided between these two domains. But maybe because I came to one from the other and went from the other to the one, back to 20th century, the kind of ability to estrange a cultural object, to see it in a new light, and then to use that as a way to understand something about it, and to apply that then to objects that belong to a remote, distant period of cultural history, to move back and forth between those remote eras, for me, has been very productive as a scholar. And I integrated into my teaching, and I integrated into the way I try to advise students to work, because I think there's something deeply stimulating about the pressure that you apply to a cultural object, whether it's a 1973 Divi Summa calculator by Mario Bellini, which happens to be one of the great masterpieces of industrial design from that period, or you're looking at a medieval codex, trying to understand how people imagined what a word, a poetic phrase, how it should resonate, how it should be experienced by a reader. There's knowledge design going into both of those, actually. However different the forms are, the way they express one another, they express themselves, or the ways that they interact between one another. So I think as a kind of interdisciplinary-minded scholar, for me, the field of cultural history, which is the one I prefer to locate myself in rather than just literary history, is always about these hybridities and intertwinings and forms of kind of hybridity that are undergoing shifts and mutations. So I think literature does drive technological innovation, just as technological innovation can condition and drive literary culture. What I'm deeply opposed to is what's sometimes described as techno-determinism, which we see a lot in contemporary discussions about innovation, where it's as if engineers are leading the way and society is trying to catch up, But I think that's nonsense. And we see, and historians of science have shown this over and over again in the 18th century, in the 19th century, and the 20th century, that culture and technology and different areas of techniques and media, they're all in a kind of interesting dynamic relation. And technological innovation is always conditioned, sometimes literally driven by culture and by social changes in social norms, long before the technology understands what it is. And I see that in my work in the robotics sector just as much as I see it in my work as a historian.
Mm-hmm. Also because like technology or technique actually from the Greek word mean actually art. Techne is really the art of doing with art, with meaning, endowing things with meaning.
Exactly, and I think the Greeks had a more nuanced understanding than we often do.
No, definitely. I want to go back to one thing you were saying on Dante's Divine Comedy, because you recalled to my mind like a famous episode in Purgatorio 11 when Dante talks about Oderisi da Gobbio, like a famous painter of miniatures. So the idea that the letter in medieval texts, in medieval codices, is actually not just a letter, but actually a world of images. It's a visual code. And also, I want to go back to your not so philological in the strict sense, in the 19th century sense, reading of the Divine Comedy, because like in your multimedial way of observing it, Dante's masterpiece really appears as a monumental web of layers and meaning, or kind of as an imaginative platform for the synthesis, hybridization, and re-elaboration of many languages and cultural traditions. Now, in dealing with the internet and the emerging reality of podcasting, it is curious that the same two metaphors often appear, the metaphor of the web and of the platform. And these metaphors kind of identify interconnectedness and experimentalism as the two key features of the media itself. Sometimes, however, especially in comparison with a great literary work like the comedy, the new languages of internet or podcasting are perceived as like too horizontal and thus depthless. How can the internet or the new media like or podcasting, how can they achieve verticality instead? Is it possible to combine lightness and depth?
I would say absolutely. What I would emphasize is that, perhaps the defining feature of a given medium is the way in which it deploys. It plays along a certain set of multisensorial capacities that we have as human beings. And every medium of communication, every genre of cultural communication draws from the full multisensorial the full sensorium that we have available to us and focuses it and channels it in certain ways. And so I think just like storytelling, face-to-face storytelling, live storytelling can engage us and in certain ways in depth as well as horizontally in time, but perhaps in ways that are different than silent reading of a printed page. I think that podcasting can do so as well. I remember just recently listening, just out of curiosity, to a podcast that my former colleague Robert Harrison has been curating for probably a decade now. He was talking with the great German filmmaker Werner Herzog about his sort of almost lifelong rumination on walking, and to listen to Herzog in his very distinctive, provocative, sometimes rather eccentric way talk about his profound conviction that walking is the foundational way in which we as humans discover the world, that you can't know a landscape unless you've walked on it, you've felt it under your feet. It was just a profound and moving conversation. Maybe it would have been even more moving if I was sitting face to face talking to Werner Herzog, but I'm not sure, because the absence of the mere presence of a voice, with only the occasional intervention of his interviewer, my former colleague and friend Robert, had its own very distinctive media affordances. And so I think podcasting is a remarkable extension, if you like, of storytelling. And I think it's capable of many different forms of engagement, from the extremely vertical, short form, entertaining, light, kind of fizzy, frizzante, as we would say in Italian, to taking us in very deep directions. And I'm an absolutely addicted listener to a national public radio. I listen in particular to the storytelling programming from The Moth to the more investigative journalistic work. And I find that those forms of storytelling take me to places that are deeply engaging and involve often real insight and learning into worlds that would otherwise be inaccessible. I think that's the demand we place on the storyteller right from the beginning. So for me, podcasting is a really wonderful, and like all powerful and wonderful media, it's light. It has a kind of lightness, technical lightness, that ensures that it can live in so many different places, in so many parts of our lives. We can transport it where the places we go, and that creates possibilities for meaning that are very distinctive and that are unique, I would say. Of course, it shares with the radio, but perhaps even go beyond the radio because of its ability to either expand or contract and to not require necessarily being connected at all times to networks. So yeah, I'm a big fan of a world where podcasts can inhabit our everyday world of experience.
But also broadcasting as a possibility to really move across time and space in the same way as books did and still continue to do. In a way, in the sonnets, in the poetry of medieval poetry, poems are often concluded with an invitation of the poet to the poem itself to fly away, to go, the so-called congedo, the idea of like transporting a piece of ourselves across time and space. So this is quite an interesting modern version of the same old-time experience. Now, in episode 21, which I dedicated to Corradino D'Ascanio, the designer of Vespa, we discussed about kind of a similar challenge to design a light and solid or sturdy body for airplanes and then scooters. Corradino D'Ascanio designed Vespa for Piaggio, which is now a Milan-based group, including also brands like Aprilia and Moto Guzzi. Now, in parallel with your academic activity, a few years ago you co-founded in Boston a subsidiary company of Piaggio Fast Forward, focused on the design of experimental robotic vehicles. And you're now its chief visionary officer. Its key product, Jita, connects the Italian tradition of Piaggio with American culture and the 20th century futurist reflection on urban mobility with a new 21st century notion of what you call movability. Can you explain what Jita is, and how do you think its cultural and technological imagination will redesign small transportation?
Well, so Piaggio Fast Forward was founded by the Piaggio Group, really thanks to a challenge which the traditional 20th century transportation companies, whether they're automobile companies or companies in any area of mobility, are facing right in the present. And that challenge has to do with what cities will be like in the 21st century and beyond, not what they were like in the 20th century, where the automobile reigned supreme and where we literally redesigned our cities to accommodate automobiles as the sort of protagonists on in the urban landscape, not to mention the rural landscape. We really redesigned the world during the 20th century for automobiles to be the protagonists, the kind of heroes of the story of modernity. So it isn't by accident that Marinetti, in the founding manifesto of futurism, imagines the new, futurist subject as the man behind the wheel or the pilot, piloting an airplane. We all know where that great adventure took us, which is to the world that we inhabit today, where cities are basically drowning in pollution and in traffic, where the actual speed that we move around the world has slowed or stayed steady for decades, and where the environmental consequences of this model of development are all too visible to us in our everyday lives. So what comes after? That's the question. Today, young people who are, 13, 14 years old, back in the 1950s or in the 1980s, they were still dreaming of buying a scooter, first having maybe a bicycle or a skateboard, then they would move to buying a scooter, then maybe a motorcycle, and then maybe eventually a car. That kind of model where motorized mobility is viewed as an extension of ourselves, of our development, our freedom as individuals, as modern citizens living in the world, has really undergone a change with the digital revolution. My 15-year-old son would much rather have the hottest new, iPhone than a 50cc scooter. I can't even get him interested in a 50cc scooter. And so, companies like Piaggio, with these iconic brands that have a tremendous history and pedigree, like Moto Guzzi and Aprilia, like the Vespa scooter, which is the world's sexiest scooter still today, they face a challenge when they start to confront the world that's emerging. And our mission, from the beginning, was at Piaggio Fast Forward, was really to go beyond the 20th century models of light mobility and to try to dream up. It's a blue sky effort, as engineers like to describe it. Really dream up new concepts for mobility in the 21st century that are aligned with emerging patterns of urban development. And one of the defining features of city development and neighborhood development and construction over the course of the last really 30 plus years, has been the increasing restriction of access for motorized vehicles to city centers and the increasing emphasis on pedestrian-only areas, and more broadly on walkability as being the key coefficient of quality of life in cities and towns. And so where we started with Piaggio Fast Forward and where Jita comes from, Jita, of course, means a pleasurable trip, typically a short trip in Italian. A robotic vehicle, which is in a mobile carrier. It's a cargo vehicle that can carry your stuff for you. It's a robot that follows you. It's not a fully autonomous robot. It's a robot that uses your body as the interface that essentially drives and conditions its behaviors. But what Jita does is it supports pedestrian mobility choices. So by movability, which is a word that I borrowed from advertising campaigns that Piaggio had used to promote the Vespa back in the 1970s, what we're really trying to focus on is a walkable future, a future where instead of reaching for the keys to the car, citizens of the 21st century choose to walk. Walking is good for them. It connects them to the places they live, they work, they play. And it is also closely associated with almost everything that we define as a quality of life factor in our everyday lives. So what are the vehicles that are going to support that pedestrian mobility choice in the future? That was the question we tried to answer by designing a little pedestrian Vespa, if you like, a kind of scooter that doesn't carry you, but rather allows you to walk more, further, and better. And so Jita is a self-balancing robotic vehicle. It's design-driven in the sense that it's styled in a way that makes it a companion you'd want to be seen with, you wouldn't be embarrassed by being in the company of. And it's a smart vehicle that uses all of the tools of contemporary optical navigation, uses AI-based techniques. It uses machine vision to essentially enhance pedestrian mobility choices. And by carrying up to 45 pounds of your things, it allows you to think differently about how you move around the world. You can park it at the front of the store, lock it, go in, perform a series of tasks, go out on a walk, come back, pick up your Jita, and head off in another direction. And it's also a vehicle that's social. It can be shared with other people. It's not a share vehicle like the bicycles you see in racks or the push scooters you see thrown on the sidewalks, but rather it's owned by what we call a crew. So a circle of friends, a circle of roommates. It's a vehicle that serves as a kind of connective tissue to your world, whether it's your family or a condo complex or a neighborhood.
The fascinating thing of what you're saying is the ability to design what we were saying before, a piece of knowledge, a book, now an object, and through this design to really fashion or imagine spaces and also lifestyles and new practices and ways of living. So in this sense, your two roles really as an academic and entrepreneur are really intertwined and part of the same journey. Where does the academic help the entrepreneur, and where the entrepreneur can make the academic better? Also, if I may, as a passionate motorcyclist like yourself, where does motorcycling fit in all this?
Well, so I really do see a lot of continuity between the academic and the entrepreneurial, and in part that I think that connection started really going back to the Dartmouth Dante project in the early 1980s, because Bob Hollander and I were talking to Digital Equipment Corporation. We were often interacting with people in the then emergent personal computer business world, and I realized in those early experiences just how driven by curiosity and ambition, not just in the sort of marketing sense, but also by how much the kind of research passions were also present in the corporate context that we were interacting with. We found a lot of very friendly interlocutors when we went and tried to get companies to give us equipment, for example, in ways that I would never have predicted. Whereas sometimes among my colleagues in the literary fields, I found less enthusiasm for these kinds of conversations. So for me, those two roles have been conjoined for really a long time. Also, as the faculty director of MetaLAB and as the former founder director of the Stanford Humanities Lab, one of the things I discovered really early on is that I had to be entrepreneurial to support and sustain even an academic laboratory, a university-based laboratory, that projects in my exact precise field of expertise were not going to come my way that would support and sustain an ambitious venture that involves lots of people, that involves administration, that involves sustaining a community of creative experts. So entrepreneurship can mean a lot of things, but one of the things it sometimes means is that you have to be willing to take risks and to try things out, to learn to do things you don't know how to do, to work across disciplinary boundaries. And so they're really interwoven for me in a kind of profound way. And I think motorcycling, to answer your last question, fits into this in the sense that learning to not just live with, but embrace risk as a connection, as a condition for innovation is really fundamental to the entrepreneurial world, but it's also fundamental to academic and disciplinary innovation. You don't immediately get rewarded even for doing things really well when they are disruptive. That's just the way that institutions work. It's not a profound failing on their part, but it is a profound attribute. And so I think for me, motorcycling was certainly, and motorcycle racing, because I was a relatively successful racer for a number of years on the West Coast Championship of the American Federation of Motorcyclists, was really a life lesson in how to approach risk intelligently, not stupidly, how to manage risk, how to manage fear, and how to work with people in a wide range of different kinds of areas of expertise productively, and to find a common language with them, which is another way of talking about multidisciplinarity. The real challenge of real multidisciplinarity is multilingualism. It's not sticking to the language you were trained to speak, but finding a common language with people who have other ways of thinking and approaching topics. So for me, they're really deeply intertwined.
So basically, the idea of entrepreneurship as an adventure, or the impresa, the word in Italian, which means both company and adventurous feat, in your work is certainly very present, where also the intersection of industria, so laboriousness in Latin, and cultura, so cultivation in Latin, are really part of the intellectual endeavor to really read through reality and connect different elements in a larger web of meaning. This is what we were discussing about Dante, the MetaLAB, and the passage from text to objects, but also the ability to read all different elements by combining them together, by making them together, experimenting, and we talked about hybridization earlier. As a last question, in all this process, what contribution did Italian culture give you in finding your own personal synthesis, and how did Italian studies help ground your research? I was wondering if you can tell some of the advantages of being a scholar with one foot in two or many more different worlds.
Yeah. I mean, it's something I think about a lot because I have no family connection to Italy or Italian culture. So as you know well, many people in our field have a very direct connection, and that was really the determining factor in shaping their choices at in the course of their university studies. In my case, actually, it was really a rather I think aleatory set of circumstances that led gradually to my interest in Italy, and then my deepening engagement with Italy and Italian culture. But it certainly had an absolutely profound effect on my on all my choices and on my, I would say, my overall sense of intellectual identity. One immediate expression of this, I think, has been part of our conversation right from the beginning, which is the importance of design. What is it that makes, especially the second half of Italian, of the 20th century in Italy so distinctive, but much of the 20th century and before and beyond, I would say, is the way in which creative practice, the artistry, if you like, the pursuit of beauty, of elegance, becomes an informing feature of engineering, technology, industry, in an incredibly wide array of sectors, and how it intersects with artisanal practice, with the maintenance of high-level artisanal practice, the fashion industry, areas of industrial design, architecture, automobiles. Like, so many of these sectors are defined by the confluence of those different forces. And Italian culture for me has been a lesson, if you like, in the interweaving of industria and cultura, precisely for this very reason. And there are, of course, some really outstanding examples of that fusion, like the history of Olivetti in particular, which you mentioned before. So Italian studies has been not just an object of study for me, but it has been a school, so to speak. And Italian industry has been part of that school as well, I would say. Whether it's from the standpoint of being somebody who teaches courses on the history of industrial design, which I do sometimes, as you alluded to before, or it's studying, or it's actually getting involved in forms of industrial exploration and innovation. So I think the interaction with Italian culture for me has been really a profound one that has left its marks on every aspect of what I do. And as regards the advantages of being a scholar with fingers in various pies, I think there are advantages and disadvantages. I would be the first to acknowledge. The advantages are that you're always learning, and my personal appetite for working in fields that I don't know remains alive and well. And I find that it keeps me fresh, and it allows me to go back to the things that I do know well with an estranged eye, with a different eye, with the ability to keep connected, not to just repeat things that I've acquired over, in earlier eras of my research, but to keep revisiting that research and expanding upon it. The disadvantages are, of course, that it's hard. You're often right at the limit of your capabilities, and if you don't like being stretched all the time and making mistakes and having to take risks, you're probably not going to be comfortable. It'll be too stressful. But the stress factor for me is just the flip side of the stimulation that comes from the ability to move between those worlds. And I guess the last thing I would say, which I think for me is really an important lesson, certainly I've learned many times over, is that it's really being able to move between those worlds is not about becoming an expert in every single one of them. That's just an impossibility. And if there's something I criticize about sometimes design thinking, is that it doesn't take seriously enough the kind of skill sets that are required, the depth of knowledge that's required to do something well. But that said, to do something well doesn't mean to not struggle with and be challenged by the opportunity and ability to work across different domains of expertise and try to bring them together, to place them in dialogue with one another, to create exciting, new things and to innovate, that is. So the adventure part is really not about becoming a polymath necessarily, although that helps, of course, but rather it's understanding the value of engaging deeply with fields that are outside your core set of competencies and allowing yourself to be contaminated by them and to be enriched by them at the same time.
This is also the kind of another last key feature of your intellectual profile, the idea of the intellectual as a translator, someone who literally carries words across, and the ability to observe one's word from the perspective of the other and understand it better, like to really see oneself from the outside. So this is also part of the effort of this podcast, to observe Italian culture from the point of view of America, and also to observe the United States from the point of view of Italian culture. It's quite enriching. Thank you very much for this conversation. We talked about the press, media, digital humanities, design, the knowledge of design, innovation, entrepreneurship. We had plenty on the table today. So thank you very much. And I think that as a synthesis for today, we can say that really to know is to design. And I hope now it's clear that, as you say, eventually everything connects. So you can leave a review of the episode on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker, or YouTube. And I invite you to subscribe to the webpage to get notifications for new episodes, and to follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter at ITA Innovators or at Luca Cottini for updates and additional materials on the podcast. In the meantime, I really want to thank you, Jeffrey, for your presence with us today and this incredibly interesting conversation. Thank you. Thanks everybody for listening. Arrivederci e alla prossima.